Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Is the University of Chicago going away? There is a stunning piece, and I mean stunning piece, by Clifford Ando over at compactmag.com. The crisis of the university started long before Trump, and it's particularly the University of Chicago. Just on the economics, the University of Chicago has now borrowed $6.3 billion. That's more than 70% of the value of its endowment. The cost of servicing its debt on the 6.3 that it borrowed, 6.3 billion that it borrowed. The cost of servicing the debt is now 85% of the value of all undergraduate tuition. The University of Chicago is in real trouble. I mean, did Brandon Johnson take over the University of Chicago? 6.3 Pritzker, a 6.3 billion borrowed, 70% of the value of its endowment. The cost of servicing the debt, 85% of the value of all undergraduate tuition. Listen to this description of what's going on there. Clifford Ando, who is a educated classicist, like in the VDH tradition. The University of Chicago is in crisis. Under extraordinary financial strain, which I just described from his piece, it has diminished its faculty-student ratio, hired hundreds of lecturers, teachers whom it pays little and whom it does not expect to do research. Oh, you mean like when Obama was a lecturer there? Anyway, I digress. It has deliberately driven down the percentage of undergraduate tuition that it devotes to actually teaching undergrads. This summer, it proposed to merge, read close, departments, send some students online, or perhaps put them on buses to study at other institutions and teach some languages via ChatGPT. It's freezing budgets, closing academic units, slashing doctoral education, and contemplating the use of restricted endowment payouts to support functions not covered in the gift agreements. The effects of these changes, writes Ando, and a further expansion of the undergraduate population already in the works with no expansion of faculty, will be dire. Fewer subjects will be taught, classes will be larger, students will have less contact with faculty, more teaching will be done by people with no formal contact with research. Ando argues, and perhaps this has been lost in the focus on the politicization of the academy, but he writes, the true problem at the University of Chicago and elsewhere is the debased ideals of the university's leadership and the extraordinary debt it has taken on in pursuit of them. The university's trustees and leaders view it preeminently as a tax-free technology incubator, and its debt load is so great that it's abandoning ideals it once held dear in order to sustain that goal of being this tax-free tech incubator. They're simply choosing not to be a university. And this is purposeful. Again, just to provide more color on the general description he offers at the outset of his piece. The reason today's Dean of Humanities wants to send students to other universities to learn subjects that she would like to cancel or use ChatGPT to teach subjects tomorrow that humans teach today is to drive the marginal cost of teaching students from 20% of their tuition down to 10%. Future applicants should also know the university plans a further expansion from around 7,400 students to around 9,000. Now, this is still, a quote-unquote elite private university, but this is impactful. It's like what you're paying for versus and what you think you're getting versus what you're actually getting. One of the things that he compares this to, just in terms of what has happened here, he talks about the focus on the university as research institutions, the focus on private licensing of discoveries made during federally funded research that was incentivized by the legislation back in 1980. I mean, so he points to that as one of the changes in the incentive structure for universities that led universities like Chicago down this path. Although Tyler Cohn over at Marginal Revolution makes the point that this 85%, the debt load of 70% of the value of the endowment at University of Chicago is not normal. He writes, no peer institution has a debt-to-asset ratio higher than 26% of endowment. So there is something perhaps a little unique going on here, but there's also some things that are consistent across quote-unquote elite universities. The other point he makes, the employment model of the research university requires the best researchers receive contracts effectively for life. So as the university's leadership flits from fashion to fashion for its own glory and the universities never realize profit, universities can rarely shed the costs of the last misadventure. That's the argument he makes about this characterization of UFC as a tax-free technology incubator from the perspective of the leadership of the school. And he contrasts that with the attitude that was prevalent 40 years ago. In 1982, a committee at University of Chicago published a report on the history and future of doctoral education. Ando writes, it's a remarkable piece of analysis and offers a stunning affirmation of the ideals of the university. It allows that interest in doctoral degrees in STEM fields had plummeted so far that one could fairly pose the question of whether these should be sustained as fields of advanced education at all. In STEM, that was a debate being had 40 years ago. The answer, according to the report, was emphatically yes. Why yes, even though interest had plummeted? Because that was the duty of the university, to sustain inquiry and training into all things that touch on human existence, both for them in themselves and because as future leaders of universities, we cannot possibly know the fashions and needs of the future. In conclusion, he writes, in the fiscal year 2024, University of Chicago had revenues of just north of $3 billion. Why not teach undergraduates according to its historic standards? Why decimate the humanities? Why pause doctoral education in fields that do not concern North America? Why disdain everything not written in English or which occurred before the modern world? Not because they need to, not because they're forced to. They're simply the express preferences of the University of Chicago's leaders and trustees. Its rank is declining, its endowment is shrinking, its investment in programs and startups are questionable. They are succeeding only in destroying a great American university. Wow. For more on this topic and other related matters, including in higher education, pleased to be joined by former Indiana governor and former president of Purdue University. He is Mitch Daniels. Mitch Daniels, thanks so much for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Hello, Dan.
So I don't know if you were familiar with this story about the situation at University of Chicago, but I mean, what is your reaction to what appears to be going on there, and just even by the numbers alone, the financial numbers?
I'm stunned and surprised. I'm going to run and get the article. I had not seen it, but I will soon. I think I keep on pretty close tabs on things on higher ed, but this is new to me. I mean, everything you talked about there is a phenomenon we've seen elsewhere, but not to that degree. Things like the debt, for instance,
Yeah.
and I wasn't associating those things with Chicago. We can go through the specifics if you like, but I'll just say generally, it would not be a good thing for higher ed if the University of Chicago hit the skids. They've been leaders in some positive ways. I think about free speech, where their principles we promptly adopted at Purdue and promoted all over the country. They stood, as Purdue did, but few others did, by the principle of institutional neutrality. Universities should not be spouting off on issues that aren't directly related to their well-being. And so I hope they get themselves, if they're in this kind of shape, I hope they get themselves back in order. Higher ed's got enough problems.
Well, what about just some of the things that are structural in universities? I mean, at least that's the argument being made here. The employment model that is described, where you have sort of, for example, the researchers receiving contracts effectively for life. Also, University of Chicago is investing in startups by its faculties. And he asked the question, does the author of the piece, can a university make rational decisions about the value of a given employee when it co-invests in commercial ventures with that employee? You're starting to blur some lines, and that presents perhaps some perils.
It does, although I think it deserves some qualification. I mean, first of all, classics professors get tenure too.
True, right.
This system, the problem of locking in a big part of your cost structure, and in any university, personnel is the biggest single part of what gets spent. And when you've locked in a lot of that, so that you can't shift to as the student interest and preference shifts, as the needs of society shift, so you can't, you don't have the flexibility to, as like any business would, to move with it. That's a problem, but it's certainly not limited to the STEM disciplines. As for the research and the commercialization part, I have to say this is something that at least our greatest universities, I think it's a responsibility to discover new knowledge, new scientific and other breakthroughs, and turn them into, as we have now for ever since World War II, our universities have been really the best breeding grounds we have for new technologies and discoveries. So it can be carried too far, and why they borrowed all that money associated with it is a mystery to me. But I wouldn't throw that baby out with so much. We do have a lot of bathwater in higher ed, but the idea that universities can continue to create new goods, services, and new science, and turn that into things that are useful to society, I hope we can preserve. What's
your general review of the Trump administration's approach to higher education to date? Obviously they're in pitch battles with Harvard, and they're catching a lot of static, even sort of compelling for financial reasons, some retrenchment by other Ivy League schools. But with respect to DEI, with respect to other aspects, admissions policies, as well as DEI on campus and the force in the manifestation of curriculum and so forth, what's your general review of how Trump has done approaching higher education, trying to improve it?
It should never have come to this. Higher ed brought it on itself through its excesses and even violations of the law when it comes to racial preferences in hiring and in admissions. All the excesses, and there were many, of DEI are very real and needed correction. So the old joke about hitting the donkey with the 2x4. First, you have to get its attention. I think that's what's happened here. I have to say I'm not comfortable with the federal government coercing and leaning on private institutions. You can make a slightly different argument where an institution is public and largely taxpayer supported. But I'm afraid that it had to come to this, or we weren't going to see reform. Higher ed, despite a few good examples, despite a lot of us urging the physician to heal himself, so to speak, wasn't going to do it. And so maybe this pressure, I think, has already begun to show some positive signs.
The Red Menace that you wrote about way back when, 14 or 15 years ago, when you were contemplating a run for president, the Red Menace being debt, not the Soviets. What's your perspective? I mean, as somebody who was, sort of warning that the bridge was out a generation and a half ago or so, what's your perspective on where we are financially as a country today?
Well, we're not in good shape. And my perspective has shifted in a pessimistic direction over the intervening years. I don't like that because I've always seen optimism as the only good operating principle. But the simple, brute, mathematical facts are that we're headed into a corner that's going to require some really wrenching changes. Back when I wrote that book, and for a while after, you could say, look, folks, let's get going. If we get going, make some changes now, we can navigate through this. We've passed that point now, I'm sorry to say, and we're Social Security is 6 or so years from insolvency. Medicare is a year or two behind that. This administration, which has done a lot of good things, has been terrible in terms of its absolutely cavalier attitude toward the debt that's being piled up. And maybe that works in real estate. You can walk away and leave the keys to somebody else. The country can't do that. And so I think we're going to have as the cynics have always said, well, it'll just take a crisis. The Congress won't act. No administration will act. They won't take the political heat that would require. Until we have a real crunch, I guess we're going to have one.
Yeah, I mean, the comparisons to like Detroit, Detroit being a microcosm of what is coming. I mean, those don't really capture it, though, because, a city that goes BK has to reorganize, even a big city like Detroit. The collateral damage is still somewhat localized. What we're talking about here at the federal level, given the size and scope and level of intervention the federal government has in everyone's lives, is going to be something.
We've become, I think, way too accustomed to bailouts, whether it's corporations, local governments, even states who conduct themselves irresponsibly, look to somebody else to pull them out of the ditch. Your state never going to live up to all the pension promises it's made. You know what's going to happen at some stage. You're going to try to dump that on the rest of the country. I'm counting on a 2 votes per state Senate, if nothing else, to block that. But that'll be coming. But a nation like the U.S. won't have anywhere to turn. And we will have to, I'm afraid, do some very unfair things. Default on some promises we've made in our safety net programs and things like that it could have been avoided.
The one of the arguments that's made is by some, particularly on the more optimistic side, you have to be very optimistic, is that we don't know what the possibilities are with this digital revolution we're in the midst of. And, with the promise of AI is the promise of growing our way out of the burdens that we have placed on ourselves, particularly if we can slow the rate of adding to those burdens. What's your general perspective? I mean, I know you stay sort of ahead of the curve on these burgeoning public policy matters. What's your perspective on AI, its dynamism, its possibilities, its the dangers associated with them?
One of my favorite cartoons from way back in my business day shows the guy standing in front of the chart with the projections on it. It's a flat line along the bottom, then it leaps up toward the right side and says, "Miracle happens here."
Right.
Yeah, right. It's not a strategy. I will say that I heard just last week a very, very knowledgeable person from the world of public finance and the economy, a name you would recognize, surprised me by saying, he thought maybe that the miracles of productivity growth that AI may produce might pull us out of this. One can hope, but again, that's not a strategy. And I think from what we can know right now, history is going to judge this and the last generation of public officials pretty harshly for failing to talk in an adult fashion to our fellow citizens and say, listen, we're going to have to make some changes here so that we can, the future will be better than today. And instead, they have allowed everything to sort of slide to the point. We just passed $37 trillion in debt, well over 100% of GDP. Neil Ferguson, probably our greatest current historian, has recently pointed out that he can't find an example in history when a leading nation began spending more on interest costs, debt service, than it spent on its defense and security. And we passed that last year, and the lines are moving further apart.
Mitch Daniels, former president of Purdue University, former governor of Indiana, and a sneaky good golfer. Very, very consistent. Fairways, it's just fairways and greens for Mitch Daniels. I know, I experienced it.
Yeah, well, I'm not up to Proft standards, but struggling along like we all do.
Governor Daniels, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Anytime, Dan. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. And you joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
A large retail store just canceled a huge order, leaving MyPillow with a ton of